Welcome to the Sober Heathen podcast. I am the Sober Heathen. I am Scott. Very excited. I'm tripping over my words. All kinds of excited things going to happen today. A great discussion. It is an honor to be with Your Honor, Mary Beth O'Connor. Thank you so much for joining the podcast. I told myself, Mary, that I wasn't going to make like judge jokes like I got to mind my business and be on my P's and Q's. They're all there for me, but I'm going to try not to do it. So thank you for being on the podcast.
Sure. And just for clarity, it actually is Mary Beth. I'm from Central Jersey, and that is a not uncommon Central Jersey name. So
thank you, Mary Beth. I just wanted to start off with, too, Mary Beth did write a book. I started reading that the other night. And, of course, my camera is going to be – isn't my camera going to play? There we go. From Junkie to Judge. It's really good. I'm just diving into it. What a great story. What a great – I mean, the thing that I love the most is the triumph, you know, from where you were and an early age, too. I didn't get started until my 20s. You started a little bit earlier than that. For the people that don't know, just a little bit, what happened? When did you start and how bad did it get?
Yeah, so the subtitle is One Woman's Triumph Over Trauma and Addiction, because those two things were definitely connected for me. So I grew up in a household where my mother wasn't bonded to me and she could be violent. But when I was 9, it got a lot worse because we moved in with my stepfather. And he was really violent with her, physically, sexually violent with me, just created a lot of anxiety. I had depression at times, sort of some OCD-like tendencies, so just a lot of stress. And when I found my first drug, which was alcohol, when I was 12, and it was Boone's Farm Strawberry Hill wine, which a lot of people know. What I noticed right away was that it seemed like it helped. You know, it seemed like it was making me feel better, and I felt more relaxed, like I could sort of wiggle my muscles, you know, and take a deep breath and giggle in a more real way. And so that just captured my attention. Like, this is a really positive experience. I need more of this. And then I just kept progressing into other drugs until I found meth when I was 16. And I was shooting meth when I was 17 years old. I was full bore addiction in high school, did not get sober till 32. So it was a long haul for me.
Yeah. And after reading your book, and I was listening to your interview with Lindsay, alcohol for me was like, I was in this really hot room and I finally got to take my jacket off. That's the kind of freedom that it gave to me. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yes. And look, if it didn't seem to help it in the beginning, we wouldn't have kept going, right? I mean, it was such a positive. And you're right. That's a good description of it as well. I just felt like I felt a relaxation that I didn't remember feeling. And that was just a very positive and pleasant experience. And for a while, it was often a positive and pleasant experience, even with adding in the other drugs, until, I really lost control and the misery started, which was definitely by the time I was, 18, I was in a pretty miserable place.
Sure. So you think, with all the pleasure that, I think AA says a pretty good one that says ease and comfort that, that first taste brings you. I know that for me. Do you think that when we get to the point where we were using so hard and so frequent, I don't remember most of those uses in the last 10, 15 years. I do remember all the good times. And it's like your brain playing tricks on you, right?
Yeah, especially, in early recovery, because we tend to think back to the positives. And I know in early recovery, I had to remind myself that the last few years, I wasn't going to parties. I would, if you invited me to a party and I said I was coming, there was maybe a 25% chance that I would show up, because I had to be the right amount of high, like not crashing and not tweaking. And, there weren't a lot of times when I was in that little limited bubble where I could actually go into society and function semi-normally. And so that the happiness time, it is a powerful memory. And especially when we start to get sober, it sort of draws us back into thinking it would be a good idea. And so, but the reality is for me that those good days were long, long, long gone by the time I got sober. And I know some people were able to, moderate later, but for me, I don't think it's possible. So I gave up everything, because I do think that even if I started with alcohol, I would really end up back in trouble and probably back on meth, just because of the power of the experience. So I just don't open the door.
Sure. Yeah, and I know some people that might listen that maybe aren't in recovery or went through addiction. They might say, well, yeah, alcohol was fun for me too, duh. But you don't see me going down into the streets or whatever. Well, I think another important thing that you talked about right away, and man, we're like 6 minutes in. I feel like we're really getting it. I love it. That trauma that you talked about, it was relief from that too. And that's what maybe the normal drinker or whatever, maybe they do have trauma, but I mean, you don't, if you're not facing that trauma and dealing with that trauma, that relief from that too is such a huge hit.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is, when I got sober, I was, to my surprise, but correctly diagnosed with PTSD. I also suffered from severe anxiety. So a very high percentage of people, probably the different data I've seen is 55 to 75% of people that develop a substance use disorder have either trauma and or other mental health conditions that they're trying to manage. And so it's a very high connection and a very high percentage. And just like those, adverse childhood experiences score that many people know about, you take that 10 questions and of bad experiences, especially when you were younger. And if you get a 4 or more, your odds of developing a substance use disorder are about 3 times higher. And my ACE score is 7. So, there was a high likelihood that that's where I was going to end up. But you're right. The good news is most people can use alcohol in moderation. Most people use all drugs in moderation. It's just the subset of us that run into trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously you had early on, I started getting the part of the book where you were going to school and then you started to have some troubles. And obviously that turned around in your 30s, I believe it was. Mm-hmm. And now you've made it all the way to a federal judge. Talk a little bit about the overcoming. What was there a specific moment? I know a lot of people always ask, when am I going to know? When am I at that point? Was there something that you can point to?
As to why I decided to get sober?
Yeah, I remember in another interview, I heard you say something. You're just like, I'm just exhausted.
Yeah, that was a bit. Yeah. And for me, it was like a combination of things. I know a lot of, in television movies, it's often this like light bulb moment, but for most of us, I don't think that's how it works. It was really sort of a progressive, like hammering. And so my 32, I was actually starting to have some physical problems, but I was just emotionally exhausted, debilitated. I felt trapped. My partner was ready to throw me out. And so it was sort of like everything in combination that made me say, well, maybe I ought to go to rehab. Maybe that would be a good idea. And I was 32. And so it was, it was quite a long haul. And I actually just had 30 years of sobriety in January. So I'm almost at the halfway point as far as that goes. But also I didn't have perfect abstinence from day one, which I like to acknowledge, because most people don't. I used 3 times in my first 5 months, and that is not uncommon. And that was actually pretty good. It was a vast improvement. And so, so we gotta look at the reality. Like 30% of my book is my first 3 years of recovery, because I wanted to show a more realistic example than I went to a couple meetings and everything was great, which is just not how recovery works.
No, it is not. And I'm so glad you said that about, like, in the beginning, it wasn't perfect, but it was pretty damn good, wasn't it?
It was a lot better. As I say, if I could have used 3 times in 5 months on a regular basis, I wouldn't have been in rehab.
Right. Oh my gosh. I try to tell people, I try to have these conversations, and I got to be careful where I work because it can be misconstrued by some who want to hear it that way, that it's encouraging relapse. And that is not the case. No. That is not the case. That is This is a growth thing. I was doing something. I try to talk about myself as much as possible, then I can't get in trouble. I was doing something every single day for years, decades, even, close to 2 decades where it was really bad. And if I put 2 months in between even a weekend bender, that's progression, right? And then I put another 2 months. I don't see why we have to be upset with people who are doing that.
That's right. I mean, I think a couple of things about that. One is that there's this ideology that you somehow go back to day one, and I don't believe you ever go back to day one, because it's not as if you have amnesia because you had a slip. It's not as if you forget everything that you learned during those months that you were sober, or during the year that you've only used 5 times. I mean, you have learned some skills, some techniques. You've experienced sort of the positive benefits of sobriety, which can help reinforce your commitment and your ability. But a lot of times it's really just that we don't have the skills yet, right? Yes. I mean, on one hand, our brain is telling us that it's a good idea. And on the other, we don't have the skills that we need to anticipate every situation or to handle the feelings that we're not used to feeling and not used to dealing with, and that can really push us. And also, we just sometimes sort of get surprised, and the trigger, what 12 steps calls the people, places, and things can hit you sort of like out of the corner of your eye and push you. So I agree. It's not that we're saying, hey, it's okay to relapse. We're saying it is a common experience. So let's talk honestly about the common experience and how people can still succeed despite not being perfect.
Sure. And I wish I could have heard this message 2 years ago, Mary Beth, because, I beat myself up. I went to treatment for 60 days. Then I went off the deep end 4 hours after I got out of there. And then I went back in, and I carried so much guilt and shame because I ended up going back to the same treatment that I went to because I loved the place. And I knew inside that they were saying something and they had something I needed. That's why I went back to the same place. There were guys still there when I came back that were there when I left, but I carried all this guilt and shame. Like, I went back out and I did all these stupid things. Yes, that was bad, and I wish that wouldn't have happened. But I still carried all the knowledge that I had for those 2 months that I had in there.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You have a base. And then the question is, how do I strengthen my foundation so that I can reduce my risk of having another slip? And that's really all it is. And like in LifeRing, which I'm on the board for LifeRing Secular Recovery, and LifeRing, when someone has a slip, we view it as a conversation, like a learning opportunity. Yes. Like, what exactly happened? What was it that caused you to do that? Okay, so what are you going to do about the calls? If it was emotions, how are you going to handle them better? If it was a trigger or an argument with your wife, or I was at a work party, whatever it is, what's your plan to deal with whatever sort of compelled you to pick up that day, so that you can have the next time it arises, you'll have a better solution, you'll have a better strategy in place.
Yeah, and you're going to help more people, I think. I mean, imagine that approach. Okay, let's talk about it. Mm-hmm. What happened? What was the root cause of this? Try to be as honest as you can. Or shall we go with the other strategy? Well, you weren't ready. Did you call so-and-so? Clearly you didn't work the steps quick enough, hard enough. All these negative things that just really, and I'm not hating on that. It works for a lot of people, and I know that, and that's okay. But from my experience with the people that are coming in and out of the door at the treatment center that I work at, I think that approach is much more productive.
Yes.
Because it's already hard enough to come back in the damn door as it is. And when you're going to get scolded, or you're going to have to sit here and listen to a lecture, I know I don't want to do that. You know what I mean? The courts might be telling me, get your ass in there and do it. But I would rather come in and find the root cause. And that's really when the things turn for me. So
Yes. Well, and the other thing is, where else do we expect such a major life change to happen immediately and perfectly? Like, it's really an artificial standard. It's not based on reality as to how people change, or, developing new habits or any of that. I mean, think about how hard it is to stick to a new diet or to start exercising more, which are much simpler commitments and changes. And yet there's this, this false, not just expectation, almost mandate that we're perfect. And then people can get into a shame spiral, which is not helpful. So it's better, I think, just to be open. Look, I used 3 times in my first 5 months. I just got 30 years. It can be part of your process, and it doesn't mean you're not trying, and it definitely doesn't mean you won't succeed.
Sure. And that's where I've evolved through all of this. I've evolved. My sobriety date is one thing, and my recovery time is something completely different.
Yes, and a lot of people do that today. It is a good way to look at it. The continuous sobriety, that's one thing, but recovery and your recovery process, that starts from the day you start working on it.
Yeah, I agree. So I'm really excited to talk about this too. You're part of Life Ring. Okay. If somebody came up and said, hey, I got a short amount of time, what is Life Ring and what's the difference between that and the traditional AA meetings?
Yeah, so Life Ring Secular Recovery, we call it the 3S philosophy, which is sobriety, secularity, and self-empowerment. And on the sobriety side, we are abstinence-based, but for us, any medication and I emphasize taken as prescribed, counts as sober for us. So medication-assisted treatment, for example, counts as sober, but any mental health meds, whatever is prescribed by your doctor, and you take it as prescribed, that's sober. And then secularity just means out of respect for all faiths and none. There's no religion in the meetings, but a significant percentage of Life Ring members have personal, religious, or spiritual beliefs. They just choose something other than 12 steps for different reasons. And one of them can be our focus on self-empowerment and the individual nature of the recovery plan. So Life Ring teaches that my plan and your plan are probably not going to be the same because we're different people with different circumstances and working on different things. And also that I am the decision maker in my plan. So it doesn't mean, and you have to do it alone. It's that you decide. And that's really how I did it when I got sober. I was told it was 12 steps only. So I looked for ideas I could use, but then I found the options. But always I viewed it as my job to sort of be proactively looking for strategies and techniques and keep my ears open. I read all the 12-step books and all the Rational Recovery and Women for Sobriety and other books that I could get my hands on. But I was always viewing them as ideas for me to think about, can I use this technique? Do I think this will be helpful for me? So it was my job to build a plan. And that is very consistent with how Life Ring views recovery. Yes,
and I love that. The personal responsibility, that almost sounds, kind of stiff, but it's not. It's empowerment,
Yes.
You have to do this. It has to come from within. That's what I believe. And sorry, go ahead.
No. I was just breathing.
Okay, yeah, no, I like that. I do believe it's got to come in. I know in other groups that it feels it has to come from without, and then you use that. I wake up in the morning in my bed, I'm by myself, I'm in the shower by myself. When I used to be able to drive, I was driving by myself. I understand the thought process that there could be a spiritual part of that with something with you. But at the end of the day, I walk into the liquor store by myself. And so I need to learn. I got to say, listen, self, this is probably not a good idea. I got to find that power. And I'm not sitting here trying to tell people that I love myself and I look in the mirror and just be like, yeah, dude, I'm not going to say I'm not saying, dude, you need to lose 100 pounds. That might be a little ridiculous, but I don't hate the dude anymore. And I can look the dude in the eye because there's some self-confidence and there's some appreciation for what I've done for myself. One thing that I go babbling on again, but
No.
when I tell people, one thing that, some of us in this little group that we have, I don't want to make alcohol my crutch for 20 years and then place it on something else to live. I want to be self-sufficient, right? I want that power to come from within. So, because if this crutch disappears, this group disappears, this person disappears, then what am I going to do? Because now I'm without that crutch again. And so I really like the self-empowering thing that Life Ring talks about.
Yeah, and I'll say this. Look. I support 12 steps when it's good fit. Some people like the structure of it. Some people find it helpful with the faith. But as I said, even a lot of faith-based people choose other programs like Life Ring. And I will say this: what I realized, so when my rehab told me that 12 steps was the only way, they put my recovery at risk, because what if I would have believed them? Because it was a terrible fit for me.
I did.
It was terrible, but it turned out that by taking control of my recovery, it actually helped me sort of build up my competence and my confidence to handle everything. Because what I did was I was doing the analysis, I was doing the research, I was doing the reading and the absorption, but then I was doing prioritization. Like when I got home from rehab, I had way too much to work on than I could possibly work on from the beginning. I had to prioritize. And then I set like my initial goal and then developed my initial plan and then implemented it. And then when I met that goal, I set the next goal and the next plan and implemented. And it turns out that that technique works for everything.
Sure. Right.
So it was really building up my reminder that I was, able to make mostly good decisions, not perfect. No, I don't care what program you pick. You're not making perfect recovery decisions or any other decisions, right? Yep. But it helped me reconnect to my own strengths, my own ability to think and to think about who I was and what would work for me. And it was really, in the long run, a real key to my success in every other area.
Heck yeah, yeah. Authenticity is such a huge thing that I think, like you said, with the treatment center that I was in the third time, I went as far as to say, I'm not an atheist anymore. I'm not sure what to call it yet, but I believe in something. And they put me up in front of everybody in the treatment center, like, this guy was a hardened atheist when he got in here. And now he has even come around. Look what can happen. And I was just doing it because I was desperate and I didn't know I thought I was failing. And I thought, here I am. I put 60 days here already and I didn't make it. Now I have to conform because that's the only way to do it. And then fast forward, I'm meeting people like you. I'm meeting people on the interwebs that are doing things, multiple pathways, taking a little bit of this, a little bit of that, yes, having such huge success. And it's like, if I only could have seen this earlier,
Yeah, but you did see it, and look, and you made it work. And look, I mean, we both know there are atheists that make 12 steps work. They find a way, and that's good for them. But it's really, to me, it's always about when I talk to a newcomer, I recommend they look at the larger programs at least, and look at not just the philosophy, but also the meeting format. Because the other thing about LifeRing is that the meeting format is very different than a 12-step meeting. And so for us, what we focus on is how was last week and what's coming up next week related to your recovery. So we don't do drug history unless it's relevant to a current issue. And also, because we don't have a speaker that's giving their long story about their drug history and their recovery, we use the entirety of the meeting for the group to share and to talk to each other and offer support. So if people are considering alternative programs, one of the things to look at is, of course, the philosophical basis and the program ideas, but also look at the meeting format, because they are really different and you might really prefer one format over another.
Sure. Well, from the way you describe LifeRing, I may have inadvertently created a LifeRing site. I call it the Recovery Exchange, and we do a check-in, kind of like, what's going on, what's coming up, and then we let the meeting guide itself and talk about, what's working and what's not. So that's pretty cool. No, I'm really excited. I'm really thank you for the explanation on LifeRing. You also do a lot of work for women, right?
Yes. Yeah, I'm on the board for She Recovers Foundation as well. And She Recovers isn't just recovery from substances. It's also recovery from trauma and mental health and other behavioral disorders like eating or gambling, grief, overwork, perfectionism. It's all together in one place, because most of the women that have an addiction have one or more of those other areas to work on. And actually 20% of our members don't even have a substance use disorder. They're only working on those other things. Okay. But She Recovers felt like there was nothing in that space. And the reality is that just as my trauma, my PTSD pushed me toward drugs, my recoveries from the trauma and the mental health and my substances, those recoveries were intertwined as well. I mean, there was an interplay between them. And in She Recovers, you get to talk about all of it. Like you could say something like, hey, this week or this month I've done well with alcohol, but now I notice my food issues are picking up, or whatever the interplay may be. You can talk about the whole picture. You're not just sort of limited to talking about your substance use.
So I think something, we mentioned the word trauma a couple of times, and I think people misunderstand trauma. I know I did. I was listening to Gaber Mate one time explain this scenario of the child and a cookie. And the child wants a cookie, and it goes to the parents, says, I want a cookie. The parents say, no, you can't have a cookie. Then the child reacts in a certain way and expresses themselves the only way they know how. And then the parents scold the child for acting that way, and the child learns emotions bad. So it could be something as simple as not being allowed to express yourself, or not being shown how to express in a way, different ways. You know what I mean? So trauma can mean so many things. Speak on that if you can.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, look, so I had some big events, right? I mean, my stepfather was very abusive. He molested me. I had a kidnapping and rape by 3 men for 6 hours. I lived with a violent boyfriend. So those are sort of like some of the big picture events. But a lot of my my mental health issues, a lot of my struggles, a lot of the impetus toward the drugs was also the lack of a connection to my mother, not having someone who was on my side. If I ever tried to like have a feeling or try to, bond to her or reach out to her or get her attention, I was rejected. And even those experiences were sort of lower key, they still had a significant impact on my development and a significant impact on my mental health and my worldview. And it took me a long time to see that. When I first went into, mental health treatment therapy, when I got sober, all I could see were the big ticket items. And it took a long time to really appreciate, these problems were there before. I mean, I remember when I was 4, I used to have some like OCD-like tendencies. I wanted everything to come out in odd numbers, like syllables and things. 4, I hadn't had those big events yet. I hadn't used any drugs yet, but it was already there from that lack of positive reinforcement, positive connection, or any real bonding with my mother.
Well, pardon for the language I'm about to use, but to me, Mary Beth, you're a goddamn inspiration. I mean, so much. I mean, seriously, what you have went through, and I'm looking at my face over here on the left, right? And it's kind of dark. My lighting's crap. And I'm really happy. And I'm looking at my face. I'm like, God, you look like a sourpuss. And you've been through all these things. And you're just, you have such an energy and a brightness about you. It's so inspiring. And I know Lindsay's over here in the comments. She's just like, preach. I love Mary Beth. And all these emojis and such. She's just going to, it's really amazing how, to know a little bit about what you've been through and where you're at. It truly is.
And that's why I share, right? I mean, the goal of the book was one of the goals. Well, part of it was stigma reduction. I really felt like showing that someone who shot meth for many years and then became a judge, that would help, hopefully help people see people who shoot meth in a different light than what you see on television on some of those, reality shows. But it was also to really be a reassurance, that there is recovery possible. I mean, not only did I use for all those many years and I had all that trauma, I didn't get sober until I was 32, which is not, young. But I will say this, though, my substance recovery, while it was challenging in the beginning, it was actually easier than my trauma recovery, and it was much faster. I was in therapy of one kind or another, first individual and then a group for women with trauma histories. I was also on anxiety meds for a couple of years. And plus I did couples counseling with my husband, but I was in therapy for about 9 years. Whereas my substance use disorder was really under control by 2.5. And that's really on the outside edge. And so it's because that the mental health was more complicated, and it came first, so it took longer to resolve. But I also don't want to scare people, because it's not like it was horrible all the way for 9 years and it was a light switch better. It was, gradually improved, but it took time, and it took a lot of effort and attention to be able to get that under control, so that I could actually live my best life, so that I can actually be a relatively calm and stable person, and so that I could actually reconnect to my inner self, be my true self, and live the life that I really wanted to live. It took a lot of work, but it is definitely possible, no matter how traumatic your past may be.
Sure, and I'm sure a lot of that 9 years wasn't forced things. Those were things that you found that worked that you wanted to continue to do. I know.
Yes.
People early on, all right, you got to go to X amount of meetings, you got to go to X amount of therapy. The courts are telling you to do all these things. That's not what it's like. I went out and found. Granted, I'm coming up on 2 years here, so I'm not. Thank you. I'm not like way deep into it, but I'm long past like what I'm told that I need to do from the courts. And, I went out and sought a psychiatrist. I've sought other additional therapy because it's good. It's good for me. And it helps. And I want to do those things. Journaling, that's a type of therapeutic thing too. Listening to music, it can be a lot of different things. And just because, I did these things for 9 years, like you said, the fulfillment starts way before that. And like the weight starts to lift before that. Right.
Yes, it's a gradual, upward. I mean, not straight up. It's always, up. But overall, it's a gradual upward progression. And part of that too for me was skills building, because, for example, when I went into therapy, my therapist would ask me to describe an experience, and then she'd say, "How did you feel?" And I would honestly, I would look confused. Like I didn't know how to answer that question. And she had to give me a feelings card. She gave me like a laminated feelings card to try to help me identify. And so I didn't even have the skill to know what I was feeling, except that I could feel things like rage, like hyper frustration or severe anxiety that I could feel. But it was all these real heightened emotions, not the true breadth and depth of a real emotional experience. And it takes time just to learn that, just to even learn how to understand what I'm feeling in the moment. And then also, I had actually a lot of bad behaviors that I needed to get under control. Like if I was triggered, if I felt fear or threatened, I could get really verbally aggressive, and I could be mean, and I could, verbally thrash people. And I didn't really want to continue doing that, but it took me a long time to be able to see it and then to be able to modify my behavior. I couldn't modify it like just because I saw it. It took gradually over time, I was able to do better in more and more situations.
Would it be fair to say, I know for me, this happened earlier today. I was playing a video game with my son, and I started to get, okay, bud, all right. I started to get in this weird funk or whatever. And I'm like, this little boy wanted to play video games with you, dude. And you're over here like, but I picked up on it, and he's like, be right back, Dad. And he kind of said it like he was kind of down. And I'm like, this is to myself, you better straighten up. This is ridiculous. You're being a little idiot right now. And when he came back in, I'm like, hey, bud. And then we had a great time, because I can notice myself starting to slip into these things and sometimes it's for no reason, but that's the benefit of this work that we put in, right?
That's true. I mean, you got to see your own behavior, and then you can modify it. And sometimes the modifying is a step-by-step thing. Like for me, it was when I was trying to modify behavior. In the beginning, I could do it in sort of the more neutral situations, but if things got emotionally heightened, I would tend to, regress. Sure. But gradually over time, I could handle even the more heightened situations. It takes a lot to trigger me today. So it is recognizing it, but then it's also trying to implement your better behaviors. And part of that is understanding your emotions. Like, why am I feeling like this? It really didn't have anything to do with your son, probably, or very little. Nothing. And so once we understand that, it can be easier to get our behavior under control.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk. We're coming up here toward the end of it, because I don't want to keep you all day, even though I think I could, because it's not only the conversation, which I love having, some people. Anyway, let's talk about stigma for a second. Mm-hmm. You talked about, from junkie to judge, that's such a powerful thing that people are like, wow, really? That can happen? Yeah, it can happen. I had a little discussion going on Twitter the other day about a pilot who got stopped before he got to the cockpit. He was really drunk. He had 2 bottles of Jägermeister on him. One was half gone, and he ended up going to jail for 10 years. And I brought up, I'm looking at some of the comments. People are like, yeah, good. They got the pitchforks out. And like, glad he didn't, he could have killed so many people. Yes, he could have, but he didn't. Somebody did their job and they kept him out of there. He spent 10 months in jail, and I'm like, why do we want to bury this guy? What if he gets help? What if he gets out, and what if he changes his life? Yes, he almost made a terrible mistake, but what I challenge them to think about is, okay, like, especially people in the recovery community, you got one OWI. How many could you have had? how many times did you get away with it? I know me, I have 4 and I could have 5,000. You know what I mean? And every single time I put people in danger, but it didn't happen. So like, why are we so excited to try to bury people who are going through and make mistakes that didn't hurt anybody? Why are we so, talk about like that stigma? Why even in the recovery community are we so eager to be okay with people 10 months away from your job and family? Man, wow.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, they're just the stigma in general, people gets judged so harshly and often judged in a way that's, I think we still in America in particular have a conflict between agreeing that substance use disorder is a disease and doing it as a moral failing or a behavioral problem, right? And so, I mean, even the government categorizes it as a disease or a disorder depending on the agency. And yet we criminalize it at the same time and throw a lot of people in jail just for basic possession. So there's this inherent contradiction and this inherent push and pull. And yeah, I mean, he when we make poor choices, we have to deal with the consequences. If you're drunk and you assault somebody, or if you're on, meth and you steal, well, we got to deal with the steal. But the meth part, we should be looking at as a health issue. It should be based on public policy and data, and let's get treatment. If I have other bad behavior, I do have to deal with my consequences. But let's at least start focusing on on getting rid of the criminalizing of what the government and most people will agree is a mental health condition, but they agree until we do something they don't like.
Right.
Or they agree if it's their friend or family member, but not if it's somebody in a different state who's in a different, environment or whatever. And so it's very problematic. And it's a big reason why we have such poor public policy in America, public health policy around substances. And it's getting worse again because we started to get somewhat better, more focused on harm reduction, more focused on let's, decriminalize cannabis. Well, it's not decriminalized, well, in the States, but federally even, they, erase some sentences and, doing things along those lines. Let's do research on psychedelics and see if there's actually any positive medical benefit to that. But then fentanyl hit, and now there's this sort of regression again in a lot of parts of the country because of fear, because they're afraid. And the easy solution is just to blame and to incarcerate and to up the penalties when, we've been trying that for 50 years and we're in a worse place today than we were 50 years ago. So I don't know why you think this works.
Right. Yeah, I don't know if we're ever going to, until I don't want anybody to experience what my family had to experience with me. But you almost have to experience these things in order to begin to understand. I know Miley talks about all the time. She had no idea this is what it was like. When she would sit in the background and listen to my Zoom AA meetings and she'd hear all these people saying and doing the things I did. She's like, I had no idea it was like this. I just wish there was a way. And there is a way. There's a way by having Mary Beth write a book, and there's a way Mary Beth going on and doing podcasts, and fighting through all this stuff, the stigma and emerging, at the other side, a bright shining star. So this is the only way that we have to do it right now, because the people in Washington aren't going to listen unless there's a really big reason to listen.
Yeah. And part of it is, the educating people on the ground, right? I train lawyers and judges about not just substance use disorder, but some of the problems that happen even with like drug court, right? Drug courts vary in quality and some of them are really problematic. And so it is partly an educational process. It's why I write opinion pieces, which by the way are on my website, junkietojudge.com. And it is why I talk. It's about stigma reduction, but it's also educating people about what is substance use disorder really and why is it hard to have a perfect recovery or perfect abstinence? But also, where are we failing people? That people who want treatment often can't get it. Yes. And we judge them as if there's a bed available for them anytime they want it. And for many, many people, that is not true. And so it's also sharing that kind of information.
Absolutely. I have people coming in off the street that can barely pick their head up that want to get into a bed and treatment, partly because they want somewhere to stay. Well, that's okay because they're in the door, and you never know what can happen once they get in that door, right? So it's not just to call and find a bed. It's not as easy if there is a bed just to get them in, and depending on what insurance they have. There's a lot of barriers that need to be had. People can't just walk into a treatment and say I need help. That's like when somebody calls on the phone at work and they're like, I have so-and-so with me, or I'm so-and-so, I'm here with my parents and I want to get into a bed. Like, to me, that's 911. We got to do this while they're ready to do it.
Yes, that's true. I mean, when I was going in my rehab, I had to be on a wait list for 10 weeks because I didn't have insurance and I didn't have money. And I mean, there are parts of the country today where you can't get treatment if you don't have insurance or cash, and not everyone has insurance or cash.
Sure.
And so it can be a trouble. But yeah, I mean, I was actually really proud because I had to call every Monday between 9 and noon. So my name kept moving up the list, and I managed to do it for 10 weeks.
Wow.
But I was living in a stable household. You know, I had access to a telephone, you know, and don't get me wrong, it was still a challenge, but it was less of a challenge than some other people are facing.
Sure. Well, I hope anybody that listened today, I hope that, you know, probably most of our listeners know Mary Beth or myself, and checking in and seeing, you know, what Mary Beth has done and listening to this, but pass it on to somebody else if you can, that may not have, they don't see a light at the end of the tunnel. You know, it took me and Mary Beth till 32. I didn't get sober until 40, you know, but I'm living a pretty damn good life right now. You know what I mean? I don't quite have that spark that Mary Beth has, but that's my goal. That's where I'm heading. One of these days I'm going to be on a podcast and I'm going to bring this kind of light, I hope. But I think people need to hear these things. So share it with somebody that might be struggling, you know. It's a 40-minute podcast. Mary Beth, thank you. Go ahead and plug your book and your website one more time, just so if anybody missed that when you did say your website.
Sure. So the book, From Junkie to Judge, One Woman's Triumph Over Trauma and Addiction, is available on Amazon and all the usual sites, and your bookstore has it or can get it. My website is junkietojudge.com. And by the way, you can message me through my website, and I answer all messages. And awesome. I'm assuming this will be tagged with my Twitter. I actually don't really like arguing with people on Twitter, but I do provide new science, new studies that come out, articles, opinion pieces, and my recovery ideas on my Twitter site. So if you're interested in that, please do follow me there. Yeah,
the articles are very good. So check out X if you're on X. Lonnie says thank you. Obviously, there's 10,000 comments from Lindsay. Huge fan. Thank you, Mary Beth. This is so much fun. Maybe we can do it again sometime.
Sure.
That would be really great. I'd really like to pick your brain on some other things, but thank you. Keep doing what you're doing, educating those lawyers and other fellow law enforcement people. You know, I've experienced some really good ones, even though it's hard to admit, but hopefully we can get some more out there. Thank you so much for everything that you're doing, Mary Beth.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. Have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.